Wesley So has come out blazing hot here in 2023. He's playing at the WR Chess Masters tournament in Dusseldorf. And in the game we're looking at today, he has the white pieces versus Jan's Christoph Duda. Wesley So is rated 2766 in this game, and Duda rated 2729. Let's jump right in. Wesley So has white, Duda has black. Knight f3 is the first move that is played, and Wesley So does something that's very common after d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2. More and more, we're seeing top players begin with this sort of King's Indian attack formation. They aren't playing the King's Indian attack, but they're starting with this setup and then attacking with d4 or c4. c5 is played by his opponent, just classical chess, occupying the center, castles, knight c6, and d4. And this transposes in almost like a Tarrasch defense situation, and eventually it's just going to transpose into a Catalan. So this idea of a King's Indian attack formation for white is sort of a transpositional device. E6 is played, all classical moves now, c4, and we're more into Catalan territory. Black goes ahead and takes on c4. White has to recover that pawn, so queen to a4 is played, attacks the c4 pawn, and also creates a pin on the knight that causes some discomfort for black, so bishop to d7 relieves that pin, and then Wesley So captures the pawn at c4, cd4, knight d4, and if you look at this position, white does have a nice pull with some real queenside pressure, particularly involving this bishop at g2, aiming at the b7 pawn. Now here, black plays rook to c8. If he takes the knight with his knight, after queen takes and bishop to c6, to challenge this well-placed bishop on g2, white just plays bishop takes c6 check. And after pawn takes, white is just better. Black just has pawn weaknesses at a7 and c6, and all other things are equal. White can just play queen to a4, and black is on the worst end of things and basically has no winning chances. So instead, Duda plays a rook to c8. This also aims at the queen, knight to c3, knight d4, queen d4, and now bishop to c5. Hits the queen with tempo and develops the last minor piece for black. Wesley So plays queen to h4, and now bishop to c6, now offering the trade of those bishops. Now first rook to d1, an intermezzo attacking the queen at d8, queen to b6. So black moves the queen, but now black is threatening this pawn on f2, threatening to take it with check. And white would rather not play e3 and block in that c1 bishop, if at all possible. So bishop takes c6 check is Wesley So's first move. Then rook takes c6. Now this next move is mind-blowing to me. Now it's not a novelty. It's actually been played a number of times. I wonder if Duda was even aware of it, however, because it gives white a very nice position. It's a shock when you see it for the first time, and Wesley So plays this move, bishop to h6, a square that seems to be unavailable to the bishop because the pawn is sitting here at g7. Well, obviously, if he takes the bishop, then queen takes knight, and black is just completely lost here. The queen attacks the rook, the king can't castle, and that would be it. One might ask the question, what if, before doing anything, black plays bishop takes f2 check? That seems like a reasonable move, but that actually would be a mistake. After king to g2, black still has to deal with the pressure over here on the king side, and let's say he castles, a reasonable response. Then bishop takes g7, king takes, and then watch this stair-step maneuver. Queen to g5 check, forcing the king to h8, then queen takes knight with check, king moves back, and then queen takes f2. And that is why bishop f2 check would actually be a mistake in that position. So Duda plays maybe the best, but also a very passive move. He plays the move bishop to f8, coming back to defend g7 with the bishop. And now rook to d3, aiming to double on the d file. Knight to d5 is played. Now this is actually a novelty, but I don't know if it's a novelty more than an act of desperation in a not-so-great position. And it gives black a permanent weakness on d5. Knight takes d5, ed5. White cannot take this pawn just yet because of rook takes h6. So the rook is now attacking that bishop at h6. So white does have to be a little careful about that. So Wesley So plays the bishop back to e3, attacking the queen on b6. And after queen takes b2, it's actually black who's up a pawn, but it's not going to do him much good because after bishop to d4, which attacks the queen, defends the rook and also aims at g7, Black is in massive trouble. Wesley So has huge pressure, particularly on Duda's king, who's just stuck in the middle of the board. A pawn is a very small price to pay for that position. So the queen moves to b4, which does create a pin on the bishop. Well, it's not a pin, but he'd rather not trade queens on h4. But rook to b3 hits the queen and attacks the b7 pawn. So queen to e7 dodges the attack, but also defends the b7 pawn laterally. And Wesley So makes an interesting decision here. He says, I'm just going to go ahead and trade queens. Even though I have an attack with my opponent's king in the middle of the board, my lead in development is going to be very powerful in the endgame. So he goes ahead and takes. And if Black takes with the bishop, his pawn on g7 would hang, along, of course, with the pawn on b7. So he decides to take with the king. So rook takes b7, check. Material equality is restored, but Black's big problem are these kingside pieces, which can't get out at all. The bishop can't move, and the rook can't move until the bishop moves. So Wesley So is doing very, very well here. The king moves to e6, rook to b8, creating a pin on that bishop against the rook. Now h5. Duda tries to activate his rook down the h-file. Rook a to b1, h4, now king to g2, king to f5. And if you look at Black's king, it looks fairly well placed. I mean, we know that in the endgame, the king becomes an attacking piece. However, it's actually very vulnerable still. White has enough pieces on the board that king could actually get in trouble even still. King to f3, hg3, hg3, rook to c4, attacking the bishop on d4, which is defended with e3. Now rook to c2. Black wants to seek activity by activating his rooks on the 7th rank. This other rook perhaps can come to h2, attack f2 and a2, and gain activity that way. Wesley So plays rook 1 to b5, attacking the d5 pawn. And if Duda defends it with king to e6, in this move, rook to e8 check, hits the king, and if king to d7, the other rook moves, and then the pin on this bishop wins a piece. So he gives up the d-pawn, moves the king to g6, rook takes d5, rook takes a2, and in this position, the bishop cannot be saved, so he just grabs the pawn, and now Wesley So plays the other rook to d8, and he is going to win this bishop, but Duda's saying, you're going to win the bishop, but maybe I can get enough activity with my rooks on the 7th rank that I can make up for the loss of that piece. He plays the rook to h2. Will his rook activity be enough? Wesley So takes the bishop, rook a f2 check, king to e4, f6, now rook to b7, attacks the a7 pawn and also threatens to double on the 7th rank, attacking g7 as well. a6 to get out of that threat, rook to a8 attacks again, rook a2 defends, rook a to a7. So instead of going immediately after the a pawn, he goes after the g7 pawn. And this forces Black's rook into a position of passivity. The whole idea was, in giving up the bishop, he'd get active rooks. But now his rooks have been forced into passivity, and he still does not have his bishop. King to f3, rook to a5, rook to b6, attacking the pawn a second time, rook to g5. The idea is he wants to play the rook to h3 and take the pawn on g3. So to prevent the rook from getting to h3, Wesley So plays king to g2, a5, now e4. There's a pin, a lateral pin against this king and this f6 pawn. He wants to play e5 and liquidate the pawn weakness he has and create a pawn weakness for Black. Rook to g4, king to f3 hits that rook. Rook goes back to g5. And now plays bishop to e3 with the idea that after rook to e5, he can play the bishop to f4. The bishop's more effectively placed there. And after rook to c5, e5. He goes ahead and advances that pawn. He can do so, again, because of the pin against that f6 pawn versus the king. Rook to h8 is played. Rook b to a6, going after the a pawn now. Rook to d8. Now ef6, gf6 ruins the little healthy pawn structure that Black had on the king side. Now it's just one weakness versus another weakness. And after rook a5, rook c3 check, king to g4. Wesley So was up an entire piece. Duda had no compensation, and in this position, he resigned. Even after going over this great game from Wesley So, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to watch is in this video right here, so be sure to check that out next. Goodbye.